Hello, this is the Patron Q&A for August 2021. I'm just making sure that the Patreon post that I set to go live is actually doing the thing that it's supposed to be doing, and that it appears to be. So yeah, I'm gonna adjust my situation here just a little bit. Get a primo view of my Blue Yeti microphone that has been serving me very well throughout most of the pandemic. And now I'm going to go back over to the posts where we have the questions. It is a little tricky to get everything squared away right all at 4 p.m. because I'm not an expert veteran live streamer in terms of being the person doing all of the production stuff. So, hi, hello, it's me. I'm Michael R. Underwood. That's why you're here. If you're here for reasons other than because it's me, that's probably good because it means that someone has recommended this video to you and it is sometime in the future and things are going nicely in some way, shape, or form. I hope you are good. Right now, the world is a mess. People at the US Gulf are in a lot of trouble because of a hurricane/tropical storm. I hope they're all okay. If you are in that area and watching now, I hope that means that you are also okay and that everyone in your life is okay. That would be great. So I did one of these Q&As last month and we got a few questions and that was very fun. And I have just published a gigantic essay about contracts and labor and power in publishing that I started writing, and then I saved a draft, and then I spent another hour to hour and a half on it and was really excited about kind of what direction it had taken and like just the writing of the essay itself. And I was very excited. And then I did something on Patreon that like deleted a little bit that I didn't like. And so when I was trying to return to the saved version that I thought I had, I lost basically all or almost all of that hour and change of work, that kind of second chunk. So I was very bummed out and just, saved what I had and put it away. And then thought that maybe I wouldn't get back to that essay or that I would wait much longer to go back and do the rest of that essay because I was really bummed out that I had lost so much work. And then instead on Sunday, I spent another hour and change on it and did kind of review and edits, and I was happy with it. So I posted it. So this month you have gotten a 3,500 word essay from me as patrons, and you're going to get this Q&A. I have gotten just a few questions so far. But if people pop in during the stream, they are welcome to ask questions, and I will try to get to those as best I can. So I'm going to start with a writing question from Paul. Thank you again, Paul, for your excellent questions. Paul says, you've been really effective in the serial nature of the Genrenauts series. What tips can you offer for writers trying to write serially in a universe like that? First, thank you. I'm glad that you like it. I've been really happy with Genrenauts as a serial work. And coming back to it, I would love to spend more of my writing time working on Genrenauts, but right now it is, since I'm self-publishing, and self-publishing is a huge hassle, and self-publishing doesn't right now pursue the career goals that I'm interested in pursuing, which is getting my work out in front of a larger number of people without having to do as much of the production work myself. Because while I have developed some of those skills when I was working at Angry Robot, I also learned that being your own publisher is a lot of extra work, and being a publisher for someone else is a lot of work. And it's been hard enough for me to write in general over the course of the pandemic. So especially right now, I'm more interested in trying to pursue some traditional publication options. But with Genrenauts: The Wasteland War, I had this draft that had already gotten some revision assistance from a while back, and I thought that it was close enough to being ready for publication that I could just go ahead and do that. And as you may have noticed, I did not do a big publication push. I didn't do a whole lot. I did do a prolonado for that book that I have for other works. partially because each episode is a smaller publication. And so if I were going to do, if I could write fast enough to release a whole season of Genrenauts, so 5 or 6 novellas inside 1 year, that's a lot of releases to promote. And the way I do Promenado is usually 6 or so weeks of pretty solid work just on that thing, or largely on that thing, which is very exhausting. So I did not really do that for Wasteland War. The core thing that I think has made Genrenauts work as a serial project is that going in, I had a lot of thoughts about serial storytelling that I have absorbed and considered based on growing up reading comics, which are largely a serial or serial episodic medium. The thing is that comics and TV span this range from purely serial to purely episodic. And so let's define terms. Something that is purely episodic is that's kind of an older TV format. And the idea there is that you can jump into any given episode and enjoy the one episode story. So you can watch shows out of order. This is especially important before the era of VCRs. So that's why you have you tend to have much less continuity in older TV shows from the era before kind of widespread VCR usage, and before there was a lot of syndication. So that is pure episodic, is something where you could pick up any given episode and have a pretty good chance of jumping in, feeling like you could quickly understand what was going on in the story. Then there is pure serial. Pure serial storytelling is something like the short comics in Sunday papers. Serial storytelling is something like Game of Thrones or a lot of prestige television, where you really cannot just jump into episode 7 of season 2 and follow everything that's going on in that episode if you've heard the 60-second brief of what the overall show is. You can't watch the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones if all you've ever heard about Game of Thrones is like a 60-second pressy that a friend gave you before you sat down to watch that episode. It does not work. You have to have all that context and the kind of experience with and connection to the characters, and to know all of the different relationships and things like that. So pure serial is a story that where any given episode is more about telling the overall story than telling a single specific story inside of that episode. Really good serial shows often have some serial episodic elements, and serial episodic is the middle ground between purely serial and purely episodic. So in a largely serial show, you might have, this is a specific theme or a setting or a sub-story within the larger story, and that sub-story plays out over this individual episode, but you still need a lot of the context coming into it, and the impact of the individual episode is probably going to be greater based on having some of that background knowledge. As you may have guessed based on my kind of descriptions, Genrenauts is a serial episodic project. I talk about it as something that is serial, but within this framework, kind of as I adapt and interpret and kind of reframe the way that kind of this spectrum plays out in comics and in TV, Genrenauts has individual episodic stories, and then for anyone who has read all of the first season, there is a season arc that plays out beginning with Shootout Solution, even though I have the kind of episode 0 that was more written as an entry point to some for new readers, because episodes 1 and 2 as of this point are still published by Tor.com, and so I don't control them in the same way. So there's like a marketing reason why I did the episode 0. So starting in episode 1, Shootout Solution, some elements are introduced that over the course of the season build into something bigger, where there's something going on that isn't just the kind of case of the week. And through the first 4 episodes, in each episode, okay, they go to Western world, they go to science fiction world, they go to rom-com world, they go to like procedural crime world. but there's also a plot building over the course of the season. So there's the A plot, which is the episodic plot. So in Shootout Solution, it is the brother and sister and what's happening to the town. And then there's kind of implicit season and series arc that is like learning what is going on with Genrenauts writ large. And then in episode 2, you have the absconded ambassador plot, where part of the group is trying to kind of cover for the absent ambassador, and part of the group is rescuing the ambassador. And then, especially in episodes 3 and 4, we start to get some recurring elements and a sense that there is maybe something going on that is more than just the kind of natural occurrence of things happening in the Genrenauts world, where, according to what the Genrenauts understand at the beginning of the series, stories just sometimes go wrong because entropy is a thing that exists in this multiverse. And when a story goes off track, it creates these ripples that reverberate across the multiverse. The Genrenauts identify and resolve the breaches created by those broken stories. So they find and fix broken stories. That is the kind of case of the week premise and status quo at the beginning of the season. And then over the course of the season, an arc plot is introduced. And that combination between episodic plot and arc plot is really that's the special sauce that makes a serial episodic show function, or a serial episodic story function. Someone could start reading Genrenauts with episode 2 or episode 3, and they'd probably be able to kind of catch up pretty quickly. But the farther into a serial episodic show you jump in without having all the context along the way, the greater the chance that you're going to miss some things. You're not going to enjoy or be able to appreciate the entire picture that combines the short-term and the longer-term storytelling. And so that was my guideline for writing specifically the first season of Genrenauts. For season 2, I wanted to create as much of an on-ramp as I could with the Wasteland War. So that involves kind of reintroducing some of the central elements of Genrenauts in terms of, here's how this multiverse works. Here's this one character. We're going to start with King, and we're going to kind of be caught up in terms of what's going on with King, what's King's relationship to Genrenauts, why is King in the situation that he is in, and then going from this one character, we pull back a little bit and get the rest of what's going on. So that is a similar structure to how I started Shootout Solution, where in the prologue we have Mallory and she's in trouble, and we introduce a little bit, but it's more kind of an evocative, action-y opening. And then we focus on Leah, and we get her entry into this universe of the Genrenauts. In both cases, I'm trying to create as understandable and kind of approachable a beginning to the season as I can. But because there's all this stuff that's happened in season 1, I would still recommend someone start with the first episode of Genrenauts, or with the data disruption, the kind of prologue. Because my economic incentives are different than a TV production company, or from a comics team or a comics publisher, I get to determine where on that serial episodic spectrum I want each episode and each season to land. In a world where I had all the support I needed and I was traditionally publishing the whole Genrenauts series at the pace that I wanted, I would try to do the whole series over the course of 5 or 7 years. Maybe not a full season every year, but I would try to release pretty steadily. And then the balance of serial episodic would move from somewhere in the middle-ish between serial and episodic. It would have moved towards serial, where the farther into the series you go, the more each episode is really a manifestation and a continuation of existing storylines, where there may still be that kind of episodic interior arc, but that interior arc plays a less and less important role than the season arc and the series arc. So I think if I get to the point where I'm writing and publishing the third season of Genrenauts, we're probably going to be largely into a serial plot. though I may still maintain that episodic structure of each episode, there is a new mission. But I could easily see in later season 2 or absolutely in season 3 a mission that spans more than one episode and not just like a 2-part finale, or a montage of adventures that kind of establish some new status quo or that kind of advance the timeline in a specific fashion. And so the one-to-one relationship between episode of Genrenauts as published and individual adventure that the team goes on, that one-to-one relationship could be broken and the ratio could fluctuate either direction. So in terms of tips for writers for writing serially, I think if you are writing serially using, if you're writing in the serial episodic universe where you want to do episode of the week, which I think a lot of people associate with Genrenauts because I have a mission every week. If your characters are not changing actively like every episode, or if character arc is not like really primary in this story, if you're more interested in the procedural structure, then I think something that's going to be a really good idea is to have characters that are really solidly defined right away. And so that rather than the reader looking for character growth first and foremost, as some readers do, you're going to focus on highlighting characters and taking characters that the reader will come to know and have a strong sense of, take those well-defined characters, and then what changes is their circumstances. This is the structure that's more like something like your Star Trek: The Next Generation begins more episodically, but by the time you get into the second and third season, you've got a pretty clear sense of who Picard is, who Worf is, who Crusher is, and so on. They don't change as quickly as maybe characters change in a more contemporary show where there's a lot of like melodrama and the characters are kind of switching sides and things like that. So with Genrenauts, I tried to come out of the gate and have a clear sense of here are these characters, here are the roles they fill, because Genrenauts also has an aspect of like heist story. So there are tools in procedural episodic storytelling that I've learned from watching things like Leverage, but also in reading a lot of comics and just absorbing a bunch of other kind of stories and works of art that use that procedural structure. And in Genrenauts, the procedural structure is story breaks, they go to a genre world, they figure out what's broken, they investigate it, they try to resolve and fix the breach. So that structure itself becomes interesting. And then many readers enjoy the series because they like the characters, because they feel like they have a relationship to them. They have an understanding of the characters. And then there is novelty in any given episode where, you know, what's the story going to be? What's breaking here? What tropes are at play? What archetypes or what kind of iconic stories is the genre series going to play with? In the Wasteland War, I kind of took the stuff that I worked on in There Will Always Be a Max, and I expanded on it. So people who like that part, or anyone who likes the kind of Mad Max apocalypse world kind of genre space, could then look forward to that episode in terms of something else to be looking for. So I think if you're going to try to do some of the same things that I did, you'll want to have a strong handle on your characters right away and to think about what is going to be novel in any given episode or installment of your story. What threads are you most expecting to be able to use to pull the reader through? In Genrenauts, I use procedural structure and this kind of dimension hopping adventure as a major through line, as a major kind of pull element. And then what stays the same is the characters. The characters do not change as quickly. And so every episode, when you tune in, you know you're going to have an adventure with this set of characters that you've come to like. If Genrenauts were a pure anthology show where it's like, here is the premise, but then every episode is a different team of adventurers, then I would not be able to give readers as much to hold on to, because then the thing that is the same would be the premise So if I have Alpha Team in the Western world, and then episode 2 is Beta Team in the science fiction world. So that's 4 elements, none of which are in common. The only thing that's in common is that the genre worlds and the team's relationship to them is the same. And that may not have been enough for people to hold on to. I think it's notable that anthology shows like Twilight Zone and more recently Black Mirror, those are not as popular. They've kind of returned in some popularity, but Black Mirror is really the one that's had more staying power. If we look at something like American Horror Story, that is an anthology by season, where each season is a set of characters and an overarching story. But then season on season, they will come up with a new premise. So it's still American Horror Story, but then they'll change setting. They'll recast the same cast as different characters. And so the scale on which it is an anthology is different. So that is kind of my overview of why I think the balance of serial and episodic that I have tried to maintain with Genrenauts works, based on what I hear from people and what I think I have succeeded in doing with the series. And my advice to writers or to anyone who's storytelling trying to find that balance with serial episodic is to think about what is consistent, what changes, and what are you intending to use to catch and hold a reader or a viewer's attention so that they feel pulled or propelled through the story. And when you get to the end of an episode, they want more, instead of going, oh, okay, cool, well, I'm just gonna, I'll trail off. I got enough of this. I learned from writer Charles Stross the term Moorish, and I don't mean M-O-O-R, I mean M-O-R-E, Moorish, as in I want more, like snacking, like was it Pringles? Whichever it is, like you can't have just one. Notable there that like jingle / catchphrase that chip company wanted people to memorize. I maintain the sense of it, but not the full write up. So like jingle writers will try to get a whole jingle and the words in your head so that the melody and the words kind of they shore each other up so that you remember everything. For that chip thing, I have a general sense of what it is. So unsuccessful in this moment. So there you go. I think in terms of writing in a multiverse, my advice is the same, which is have some elements of continuity, either universal, like an element of the premise that applies across the multiverse, which is there are worlds that operate by story logic and they have a relationship to each other. They are interconnected. They are not all atomized and kind of closed off. It is an open system when you look writ large versus 100 little boxes that don't cross over with each other. I think if you are trying to write in something in a universe or in a setting where the rules of storytelling and genre are relevant, then you want to figure out what rules are you going to highlight, how are you going to explain it, but what is your attitude toward that? The characters in Genrenauts have attitudes toward the conventions and archetypes in these story genres, especially the characters that are more familiar with them. I, as an author, have perspectives and ideas and thoughts about genres and successes and failures and trends and relationships between genres and elements of cultural beliefs. So I have something to say. So I'm using this framework to raise questions and to make points, rather than this is a sandbox. It is a sandbox, but then I have other things that are going on. And I'd like to think that helps make it more resonant or broadens or deepens the appeal, because the sandbox is cool. And I like to think that I'm doing something interesting with the sand in the box and the tools that I brought. If I can stretch that metaphor just a little bit more, I think it's fine. All right, next question. What games do you think are good for first-time GMs? So I saw this earlier, and I thought, that's a very good question. And then I scratched my chin, and I have some thoughts. I think this would be a great panel topic, because I'd love to have the conversation about this with other people, especially people whose first game they GM'd was not D&D, and people who have come to the hobby much more recently. So even if they did start with D&D, they started with a different D&D than I did. I think I maybe played some of one of the boxed sets, but really the D&D that I played a lot of first was Advanced Second Edition. That's like the black hardcover with kind of blue and white lettering, and the like fighter on the horse with like the winged helmet. That one. I started with D&D. If someone were getting into role-playing games now and they had never played any game and never run any game, I certainly would not recommend that version of D&D that I started with. And I don't know that I would recommend 5th edition D&D. 5th edition is, I think, the version of D&D that I like the most and would be most interested to play in a lot of situations. If someone was like, hey, we're going to play D&D, and it's like, I'd really like to play with these people, but I'm not super keen on D&D, maybe I'll give it a shot anyway. The thing with D&D is it has some advantages and disadvantages. A big advantage in starting with D&D 5th edition as the thing that you GM first is that a ton of people do that. And there are a lot of resources on the internet and physical, like human resources in terms of like people you can talk to who GM/DM D&D 5th edition. So there's a bunch of people who all have their own experiences and may be happy to share advice. There are many, many YouTubers whose all or almost all of their YouTube video content, video producers, Twitch people, so on and so forth, what they do is talk about running D&D. So there's a lot of resources that you can draw upon. A downside with D&D is that there is too much to learn everything all at once. And if you just start with if you have just the 5th edition Player's Handbook, hundreds of pages of rules to read. If you want to read then the Dungeon Master's Guide, several more hundreds of pages. Then you have a Monster Manual, which is more hundreds and hundreds of pages. So reading all 3 of the core D&D 5th edition books is close to 1,000 pages of content. That is a lot of things to read and try to internalize. You don't really need all of that to run your first game of D&D 5th edition. I think, there's been 2 different starter boxes, and it has a starter adventure, and that will get you going. Another advantage that D&D 5th has is because there are so many rules, if you want to go and find those rules, if you would like to have more of a support structure of, I don't want to have to make as many judgment calls because I don't feel confident in my GMing, I'm going to refer to this rule book. That may be of some assistance to you. But there are as many different ways to GM it as there are people who GM, and probably more, because I know that my GMing style has changed over the course of my experience with the field. It changed a lot in the 2010s as I started watching actual play of Power of the Apocalypse games and then Forged in the Dark games, because those design traditions make some suggestions about how to DM or GM, and tools that GMs can use to move the story forward, or to kind of be an interesting contributor to the overall work that is playing. One bit of advice that I would give for new GMs is, there for a long time was a widespread belief that the DM was a service job, that the DM or GM was doing an act of service, that their fun was subservient, like was kind of second priority to the fun of the players. There are a lot of games and GMs and players out there who now strongly disagree and break from that expectation and that idea. There are a lot of games that position the GM or the facilitator or the storyteller as just one of several roles that players can play. Okay, when you play game, it's going to be a game for 3 to 5 players. One of those 3 to 5 is going to be this role, the GM, and the others are going to be this other role, players or performers or actors, and there's a bunch of different language. In that situation, they establish GM and player as 2 different roles and do not establish one of them as you are in charge and the other one is you are not in charge, you are subservient, you must only react to this. There may be people for whom it is easier to have that hierarchy, as long as everybody is respecting one another's fun and you're using some safety tools to ensure that that kind of hierarchy is not going to create any, it's not going to create any like coercion or any bad experiences where someone feels like they can't say something, they can't push back because person X is the GM. And also that the person who's the GM does not get like overstressed or overloaded because they feel like there's so much pressure on them to basically make sure that the players have a good time, which is something that I have certainly thought about a lot. And it has been hard for me to, I have not so far fully moved out of the mindset of the GM as kind of being there to help the players have a good time, because that was so central to playing and jamming for a long time for me. But I've tried to move more toward thinking about players as collaborators, and that my role as a GM is more about facilitation than about being like the storyteller with the big DM screen and I have all the secrets and here is my plot and you will come through my maze. I don't really do that. Especially in the last 2 years, had a lot of experiences when I'm GMing where it's like, oh, I've got some things in mind. I've got a sense of where the world is. And then I'm surprised by my players. And I get the fun of reacting to what they do, where in a kind of traditional, especially D&D structure, it tends to be the DM presents the situation and the players react to the situation. And then the DM resolves the player's intents. And that's how the world state changes. You can really be much more like conversational back and forth. And there are also a lot of games where there is no GM. And so maybe if GMing is scary, you might want to start with a game that does not have a GM. There are a lot of them out there. A contemporary framework that a lot of people are using is belonging outside belonging, or no dice, no masters. It does what it says. There are no dungeon masters. There are no game masters. Everyone has more or less an equal role within play, and you're all supporting and enabling one another's storytelling and reacting kind of in a non-hierarchical fashion. All of that said, I'm going to present a few other options for what might be good first-time games if you've never GM'd before. If you've never GM'd before, but you think that the type of fun you're looking to have is really about improvisation and about finding and making a story together with people and kind of going in without having to do a lot of preparation, I would recommend games from the Power by the Apocalypse framework. So that is, the first game of that is Apocalypse World, which is a fairly like gritty and dark post-apocalyptic science fiction game. And it's created by Vincent and Magai Baker. There is a version Burned Over, which is like less gritty. It's more PG-13-ish. In the Power by the Apocalypse structure, or PBTA, there are GM principles, and those are really handy to have in mind because they are basically a set of GMing tips and guidelines for you to use. So if you're GMing for your first time, you could just print out the GM principles, and whenever you're in doubt, you can look down and kind of review these 8 options. Like, okay, what seems like it's going to help us continue to tell the story here? Is it asking questions? Is it addressing the characters? Is it addressing the players because the characters are stuck and the players also seem to be stuck? And in PBTA, most games are going to have their own set of GM principles. Many will also have player principles, which are the same type of guidance, but for players. The trick with PBTA games, in my experience, is that because they are improvisational, they do require a lot of that on-the-spot, quick, creative thinking, because you're usually playing in a less firmly defined space, and you are relying on collaboration and emergent storytelling versus in D&D, I have this module, it is several hundreds of pages, and I can use this. And even if I'm like diverging from it, I have this pretty strong and extensive safety net. There are not a lot of published modules for PBTA games. There's not zero, and you could probably go and find some, especially for the more popular games. Within PBTA, some options. If you've played D&D, but when you start GMing, you'd really rather do something that's more like narrative focused, you might consider Dungeon World. Dungeon World has been very popular. It is basically a Powered by the Apocalypse game answer to D&D, and it also has some elements of what is called the Old School Renaissance or Old School Revolution, OSR, which is about, as I see it, recreating some of the feel of old like 70s and 80s D&D and D&D predecessor games without necessarily having as much mechanical crunch, or maybe without being D&D, because role-playing game design has advanced since then. There are a lot of other tools that people have. A downside with Dungeon World is that a co-designer, one of the co-designers has revealed himself to be a pretty substantially bad actor due to some one especially terrible experience that he produced while he was GMing something, and then kind of burned his whole career down by doing that screw up and not responding very well to it. So there are people who understandably might not want to give that co-designer money anymore. This is up to you. Make your own decisions. If you are a big superhero fan, you might want to start with Masks: A New Generation. That is a teen superhero-focused game. It's very much attentive to and interested in character relationships and in emotional states. Its major touchstones are comics like Teen Titans, Young Justice, the cartoon, or something like Gen X or New Mutants on the Marvel side. If you have a background with comics and you play Masks, you'll have all of that kind of love and experience with a specific subgenre space in superheroes that you can draw on, which may make the improvisational aspects of GMing a Powered by the Apocalypse game easier. And each playbook, the kind of roles or classes in Masks, are written really thoroughly with a kind of thematic arc or a thematic question in mind. And by reviewing what the game has to say about any given playbook, there are just straight up GMing tips for how to engage this playbook. And so those tips plus the GM principles will give you a lot of prompts for how the designer at least may encourage or may suggest that you act or run your game in order for everyone to have a fun time. If you like heists, and if you like something like Leverage, or if you like the world of the video game series Dishonored, then I would recommend the game Blades in the Dark, which is a game about kind of desperate scoundrels in a haunted industrial fantasy city. It trends toward action and like fast-paced missions. You are like scoundrels. You're doing thieving stuff. It's got a mechanic for flashbacks. One of its other touchstones is something like Peaky Blinders. An advantage of Forged in the Dark games is that they build on a lot of elements in Powered by the Apocalypse, but they kind of zoom in more. Like there's kind of more mechanics overall, and it's really specifically designed to play a group who is trying to make changes in the world to accumulate resources and pursue their own agenda. And it has a strong play flywheel of you decide to go and do a job. You do some recon and legwork. You get onto the job. Things explode, complications ensue, the story progresses until you resolve the job. Either you complete what you set out to do or you fail and you bail. And then there is some aftermath. There are kind of entanglements that come out of the pushing that you've done on the world. The world will push back. And then there's a downtime phase. So there's a built-in rhythm in the game that you can follow, which will let you have some moments that are a little bit lower, like slower paced and maybe more character focused. You can play characters pursuing projects over a longer period of time. And there's a lot of rules and tools in Blades in the Dark to kind of make that pacing flywheel continue to advance in a way that feels like the kind of increase in pacing in a lot of TV shows, where you establish a rhythm, new complications are introduced, and then the end of the season is just like, go, 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 everything's exploding, what's going on, wow, and big climax. Powered by the Apocalypse has some tools for that as well. Especially, I've seen that in Apocalypse World, and I think in a lot of other games, there is some of that pacing that is built in as well. But Blades in the Dark is a game that I played a lot, and I think it has good tools for that. If you are a really like narrative-oriented player, like if you're thinking about, okay, I want to run a game, but I really, really want to focus on just the storytelling, and I really don't want I don't want to get bogged down in rules very much, but I am comfortable in like thinking about and working, like dealing with like qualities and descriptions of parts of story, and almost like thinking about storytelling as like a way of combining elements like character and idea, or the fact that we're fighting in the dark is really going to be relevant here. Then you might want to try a game called Fate Core. Fate uses fudge dice. It's got there's several steps of design history, but Fate Core has 3 versions. So there's Fate Core, Fate Accelerated, and then there's a third one whose name I don't remember. Fate Accelerated is a more streamlined version of Fate Core, and then I think there is an even further streamlined version. The advantage there is if you start reading about Fate and the basic idea is interesting to you in terms of, here are some aspects that are important characterization, they're important descriptions and truths about the character. If that idea seems interesting to you, you might want to investigate Fate. An advantage with Fate is that there are a lot of supplements for the Fate games, especially Fate Core, because it was the first one. And those include a lot of different setting books, campaign settings, and so there's going to be a bunch of material there. For something like Blades in the Dark and Apocalypse World, the way they were published, they did not then have 12 supplemental books that were released all just for that first game, which is a big difference between games like that and games like Dungeons and Dragons, or a lot of games that I grew up playing, where the company makes this game and they're focusing on publishing books and supplements for this game over the course of several years. Something like 7th Sea, Legend of the Five Rings, any of the White Wolf games, those have the advantage of a lot of material that if you want to have a bunch of things to expand and unpack the world, the material is there. For a game like Apocalypse World or Masks, there's not as much. Masks does have some supplements, however, so it's a little bit of a middle ground. It's a game that I've been listening to some actual play lately, and I really like superheroes, so it's definitely been on my mind. Beyond those, I think what a good first game to GM would be is really going to be, it's going to depend on the person. And so I would have a conversation with someone about, like, what are your genre touchstones? Like, what are big inspirations and influences on you as like a storyteller and as a creator? What type of play and fun are you looking to have as a GM? Do you have a sense of what type of interests your players have? Do you have some touchstones in common? Do you all like, survival horror? Do you all like superheroes? And then I would be pitching games based on that to help someone feel less intimidated when they start GMing. But the kind of last bit of advice that I'll give on that is, if you find people who are going to be supportive and who are excited to play with you, a healthy game group, the group will help you when you're GMing, even if you're brand new, because players can help you by being really clear about what they want from the game, what they don't want from the game. They can communicate, they can share spotlight with the other characters. They can help you with mechanics, where maybe if some of your players have played the games that you're starting to GM, they can help you out by saying, hey, so it seems like you had a question about this rule. I've always played it as this. And so you can offload some of that mechanics mastery question to your players. So if you feel like you've got a good group, or if you are going to GM for the first time with a group that you've been playing with for a while, trust that if you're confident and feel comfortable and supported playing with that group, they should extend that comfort, that confidence and support to you as a GM. If they don't, that's a different problem, and I would have to have a different conversation in terms of what I might suggest for how to maybe make that better. Usually the advice in these situations is have a grown-up conversation as respectfully and functionally as you can and figure out whether these are irreconcilable differences. That's the short version. And the last question that we have, again from Paul, is what can a GM learn about GMing from being a player and vice versa? So this builds a little bit on what we talked about previously. As a player, I have learned to think about how can I get the most out of like my turn in a game where if there's 4 other PCs, I want them to have spotlight, and then I'm interested in what their characters are going to do and their cool abilities and their individual plot lines. But if we're in a situation where it's kind of like a rotating spotlight across the adventure or across downtime, I want to think about how to kind of come up with the coolest, most interesting version of what I could do on my turn to build in what other people are doing in the story and to have the kind of fun that I'm looking for. In a campaign of Beam Saber that I played in, I pick my character's drive based on basically a character arc that I wanted to explore for this person, which was someone who had some guilt about what they'd failed to do and like kind of failing to help people in the past. And that since in Beam Saber, you're always stuck in this war, having a character whose big goal was about trying to help some people get away from the worst parts of the war, that let me play in the thematic space that is kind of at a core of Beam Saber as written, that is interesting to me and would let me not feel like I had to just buy all of the premise of you're in the war is your life, you are just going to tell a story about war. Okay, well, part of war stories writ large is the fact that wars displace people and that wars hurt civilians. And so playing a character who was attentive to civilians let me find my own fun and kind of fill out the world in a way that I was looking for. In a game like Beam Saber, if I'm GMing, what the players pick as the drives for their characters, I'm going to take as flags, as indicators, as the player waving the flag. This is where that term player flags comes from. Saying, this is what I want from the game, or this is the type of fun that I'm interested in having. And so if I'm clear about that as a player, it makes it easier for my GM. And so when I'm GMing, I think about what player flags can I solicit from the players? How do I read behaviors as player flags or player interest? In terms of things about being a GM that have made me a better player, I think the improvisation and description that I do as a GM has helped me become more evocative in my descriptions as a player. GMing helps me understand rules of things better, and playing helps me understand the rules so that I can be a better GM. So there's like a solid feedback loop there. Other things, lessons back and forth. These are both things that I've learned a long time ago and things that I'm continually learning and reaffirming. So it's a little tricky to step outside myself and think about them all the time. Let me ponder for a moment. So yeah, a thing that I've taken from GMing to playing is asking questions. So Power of the Apocalypse games and Forged in the Dark games talk about asking questions and then elaborate on the answers or follow through on the answers. GMs in PBTA games are really encouraged to ask questions of the players and ask questions of the characters. So that would be like, a character who is named Gear. So Gear, is this the first time that you've used this superpower? Or I might ask, so Gear, why is Notebook so angry at you? And I'm just introducing the fact that this character Notebook is angry at the character Gear. So you can ask leading questions to invite and make space for the player to add color to the world, and you can kind of put them on the spot. The player-to-player version is less put someone on the spot and more show interest in the character or in a part of the world that the player seems to be interested in as they express through that character. So I might ask another player, hey, I'm really curious to find out more about your character's relationship to this part of the world, or I'm curious what your character is thinking at this time. And so that is a moment where I, as the player, am asking on the player level as a co-storyteller to this other player, and I'm showing my interest as one of the people involved in telling the story, which then communicates to that player that there is a specific ask and there is interest in following a thread that maybe that player didn't know other people were interested in. And so there is some utility that I've found in stepping back out of character and operating as a co-storyteller, not taking authority from the GM, but using some same tools as a player. Instead of asserting things about the world, about other characters, I can ask, or I can maybe offer something that I've come to do is, can I offer a detail, or can I add a detail, or can I suggest something? And that way I can provide some a detail or an idea for someone to use or discard. And that's a collaborative storytelling tool. I use it often as a GM when a player seems like they're stymied, or when I'm trying to clarify options. I might say, well, you could do X, or you could do Y, or you could do something else. As a player, I'm going to try to focus on shedding spotlight or sharing spotlight with that other player, with that other character, and letting them kind of use that space. Or when, if the action is coming to me and I feel like we haven't gotten enough of, or we haven't gotten to see something from one of the other characters, or one of the other players has been quiet so far, I might, as a player, say, oh, I'm really interested in what's going on with Sal over there. Can we actually, I'm fine if we jump to her. Or as a player, I might say, well, I've gotten everything I want out of this scene. I'm fine to move forward. Or I might say, and maybe this is a good place to cut to the next scene. And again, that's speaking as a storyteller on the storyteller level. Even while I am a player, I'm not assuming the authority, but I'm making a suggestion for others to react to if they're interested. And I try to take cues on how much to do that from the GM, because I really don't want to step on the GM's toes. But I've found a lot of fun in that work of trying to help stitch things together and balance spotlight and kind of encourage players to kind of dig deep and pull things out of their characters so that the overall storytelling is richer. And that's been really fun. So I think that is a live stream. Just 3 questions, we ended up with a lot of good material, so that's fun. If you are, you're watching this on the VOD as a patron, thank you so much for being a patron. In a few weeks, I will set this live on YouTube. So if you've watched this, you could watch the next one much earlier by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Michael R. Underwood. If you are just coming here randomly because the algorithm has sent you, or a friend or someone else has sent you, thanks so much for watching. If you've enjoyed what I have to say here, then I would encourage you to do one of 2 things, both things ideally if you're super excited. One is to check out the actual play that I do as a player and GM at Speculate. You can find that at speculatesf.com. We do live streams and podcasts. Right now I'm GMing a series of Rebel Crown and playing in a game of Blades in the Dark, but we are approaching a possible ending for some of those. There's going to be more in the future. Also, as I mentioned with Genrenauts, I am an author. I have a whole bunch of different science fiction and fantasy books. Right now you can read a bunch of different things in Genrenauts. And my latest novel is Annihilation Aria, which is a found family space opera. Kind of what if the 1999 The Mummy was smushed together with Guardians of the Galaxy? It's a little bit of that vibe, because you got an archaeologist and like a fighter adventurer who are married. and that it's a little bit like the second Mummy movie. And you can find stuff for me as an author at michaelrunderwood.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike R. Underwood. I do a lot of signal boosting, but also talking about writing and gaming. And if you're not a patron already, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Michael R. Underwood. Thank you very much. See you next time.